guys are listening to, or possibly even watching, if you're the kind of person who likes to watch podcasts, the Confronting Christianity podcast. I am here with Marian Jacobs. Marian is passionate about writing fantasy, science fiction, and Christian story ethics for the edification or building up of the church and the glory of God. She and her husband have 3 children, like me and my husband, and many other people. When she's not writing, Marian spends time serving on her church's worship team, watching movies, listening to audiobooks, and working on her seminary degree. And Marian is the author of the recent book on magic and miracles, which is why I have invited her to come and talk with me today in particular. Thank you for joining me, Marian.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You say that you like watching movies. I would love to hear, just like shooting from the hip, one of your favorite movies. I know it's almost impossible. I find it impossible to say like, this is my favorite movie, because there are different ones in different categories, but like hit us with a movie you think that people should be watching because it's amazing.
Yeah, that is really hard. I don't have a favorite movie. I think 2 of my favorite movies, but that have been favorites for a very long time, is the old West Side Story and Howl's Moving Castle, which is a Studio Ghibli movie. I was a theater major in...
Oh, wow. I've heard of the former, but not the latter.
Oh, okay. It's actually was based on it's an anime, but it's based on a novel. So both I recommend, although the magic system in Howl's Moving Castle is not perfect, even by the standards I set in my book, but I still love it.
Interesting. And you were saying you were a theater major.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was a theater major, and I'm actually sitting in a costume shop right now I work just part-time doing costumes for a small professional theater in Southern California. And so I love musical theater.
Yeah, it's so fun. Yeah, for those who are watching, you'll be able to see these amazing dresses and jackets and things in Marian's background. I, like you, have 3 children. And my youngest, so I have 2 girls and a boy. And one of my great loves in terms of literature that sort of shaped me as a human being and things that I kind of most wanted to pass on to my children is my profound love of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And so I read those books to each of my older kids. And then now I'm reading, currently in the middle of The Return of the King, the sort of 3rd book in the trilogy, to my 7-year-old Luke. And he is loving it in a way that his big sisters didn't. And so this is like bringing immense joy to my maternal heart to sort of be able to share this thing that I love so deeply with my son, who is also just like totally into it and enraptured by all the kind of complex and moving and poignant and exciting and challenging things that happen in their book series. But I would love to maybe start there in terms of unpacking our topic for today around like from a Christian perspective, and you and I are both sort of coming from that perspective. How should we think about books like The Lord of the Rings that are set in worlds where there is magic and, you know, there's good magic and bad magic, or at least there are sort of good and evil people wielding magic one way or another. Given that in the Bible, we read some pretty clear prohibitions on engaging in sort of magic or trying to sort of manipulate spiritual forces for ourselves.
Yes. So that question is the one that I took an entire book to discuss. And I think it's complex. Attempt to say it simply, I think that fantasy, and even fantasy with magic in it, at a basic level, things like Lord of the Rings that have these other worlds, or Narnia in which you have portals into other worlds, I think these things help us wrap our minds around the concept of God, of the otherness of God, that this invisible being exists in this spiritual realm that we can't see. I think to be able to say that there's something out there that is different, that is supernatural, that is that we maybe have to go through to see exists in another dimension. You know, that these types of concepts, it increases our ability to being able to immerse yourself in a fantasy land in which you're seeing and experiencing, mentally seeing and experiencing things that you would not see in normal reality. Those things like help our minds and help our hearts to adapt better, to be able to say, yes, God does exist. Not only God, but he can do anything. And he is not like us. Where he is and what he is unlike what we are and what we see on a daily basis. And I think that people, because of the immense importance of that, and how much it has a huge impact on both our, as your son is experiencing, he's experiencing it both cognitively and emotionally, and even in some degree to spiritually. I think that is, it really touches us as whole beings. And I think that we greatly undervalue fantasy in the church. So
interesting. Yeah. So it's funny that you expressed it like that, as a sort of way of helping our hearts and minds like wrap themselves around the reality of God and of a sort of extraordinary spiritual being beyond our sort of wildest dreams, as we experience worlds that are ultimately sort of fictional. So it sort of helps us to understand that there might in fact be a real all-loving supernatural being who relates to us in tangible ways by immersing ourselves in worlds that are not real. It's funny, I'm sometimes asked, why I'm a Christian myself, or like, how did I become a Christian, or what is the thing that most compels me about Christianity? And one of the most honest answers to that question, I mean, there's a whole sort of host of answers that I could give, but one is that I grew up reading and loving The Lord of the Rings, and my understanding of the real world that we live in as ruled over by Jesus, this extraordinary person who, the sort of incarnate human who died 2,000 years ago and broke through death and invites us into a world sort of both here and now and in the future in a much more kind of glorious way that is truly magical, to sort of appropriate that term. The fact that Christianity actually offers an understanding of the real world that is even more beautiful and amazing than the world that Tolkien creates in The Lord of the Rings is actually a big piece of the reason why I am a Christian, even though it's not something that I could kind of rationally argue to somebody else. It's like at an emotional level, like a big piece of the reason. What would you say, Marian, to someone who said, okay, I understand the power of fantasy, and especially kind of fantasy that draws on these sort of magical themes, and that's precisely why I think it's dangerous for Christians, and why Christians shouldn't be reading stories like The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter to their kids. How would you respond to somebody who's sort of coming from that perspective?
I mean, first of all, I would empathize with that, especially because as a lot of some people in the church, not all, some people in the church tend to live. We say, I believe in the incarnation, I believe in the resurrection, I believe in this invisible spiritual being, and yet on a daily basis we're living like materialists. And it's this sort of we don't really live like we believe that God can do anything. We don't really live like we believe in angels and demons and miracles, and we don't live that way on on a daily basis. And I think the people who are able to say, I believe in the power of the devil, I believe that these things are dangerous, I believe that there is the occult out there and that Satan is at work, in some ways, that's actually a very beautiful thing. And we're seeing, of course, you can take that too far, and there are certain branches of charismatic denominations that do take it too far, and become kind of obsessed about it, and etc. But I think first I would affirm the occult is real, and Satan is real. We shouldn't act like these things don't exist, because I think that undermines who God is, and like you said, the incarnation, the resurrection, these things that are miraculous, that are magical. At the same time, the supernatural is God is sovereign. God is in control. God is all powerful. Any power that Satan has, like, he doesn't have power in and of himself. And so to be able to say, God, like, the power that you fear, God has already won. And we are telling stories about that. We're telling stories about this all-powerful being. And yes, there is evil in the world, but what we have seen is that the supernatural power that that Satan has been allotted, that he is using to destroy and to hurt people, and through people who are in the occult, and using, very real, witches and magic and New Age, all these things. These are very, very real. I think that, we have to say, but we have seen Christ conquer that in his resurrection, and in this ultimate show of his supernatural power. He has conquered death. And our stories that is what these stories are saying, Harry Potter included. And I think we see that very, very clearly at the ending of the book. And some people are not necessarily familiar with that, but when we interweave, especially in Christian fantasy, where we are weaving together stories of self-sacrifice, of Narnia, in which we see this like Christ-like figure conquer death. It speaks to God's ultimate power and his ultimate control and his sovereignty. And to be able to fear these things is attributing more power to Satan than he really has.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the famous Narnia example of, for those less familiar with the stories, of sort of Aslan, who sort of depicts Jesus, I guess, in the Narnia series, who's the sort of great lion who is the king and incredibly powerful, who gives his own life to save a rebel who has been kind of claimed by the White Witch, the sort of evil sort of protagonist or antagonist, I guess, in the series, is sort of very directly and obviously pointing us to Jesus' sacrifice. I've just been reading in the Lord of the Rings, so sort of towards the end, and so one of the narratives we've just read is the leaders of the people who are trying to sort of fight against Sauron, the sort of evil overlord who's trying to take over the whole world with his evil. They've just decided to go and fight a battle that they know they cannot win, because they're sort of offering themselves up as bait, as a corporate sacrifice, in the hope that this little teeny tiny hobbit person, Frodo, and his best friend Sam, will be able to get Sauron's ring to Mordor and destroy it. And they're like, we know we're walking into a trap. We know we're going to our deaths, and that's okay, because this is not about us. And at the same time, we see Frodo and Sam basically saying the same thing. We know we're going to die. We know this is a crazy plan when it comes to defeating Sauron, because we're not trying to fight strength with strength. We're actually trying to fight strength with weakness and hope and belief that there is in kind of C.S. Lewis's terms in Narnia, like a deeper magic that's going to win. And to me, that ignites so much of my kind of Christian heart, and the belief system that at the center of Christianity, which says, actually, the greatest victory ever won was won by this man who intentionally allowed himself to be crucified and then rose from the dead. And it wasn't that he just went and like fought the battle in using power that in ways that we would understand, but that he actually gave himself up. It's this radical inversion of power. And I think our world today is still sort of desperate for that and looking for that, even people who would never identify themselves as Christians or think that they've been sort of that song has been kind of crying out to them. Even I was thinking this morning, my daughter emailed me from her history class saying her teacher had just quoted Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King saying that the arc of human history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I said, oh, did she quote that in context? Because in context, what King is saying is, I think it's something like evil may so triumph for the time. I'm paraphrasing it wrongly. That Caesar may be on a throne and Christ on a cross, but that same Christ is going to conquer death, and even Caesar's sort of timeline will be measured from his birth. Again, I've completely botched that quotation. But the only reason we think, or the only reason King was sort of saying that there was an arc of moral history that was bending toward justice, was because of the triumph of Jesus and the crazy inversion of the cross. And many in our world today have sort of taken that hope out of Jesus's hands, or out of the context of recognizing who Jesus is. And if the Christian story isn't true, there is no moral arc of human history. There is no hope of ultimate justice. We don't even know what justice is, or what good and bad might be, because we've got we've sort of got nothing left in our hands. Sorry, I got a little overexcited there, but just to resonate with what you were saying about these stories that show us that actually, if Christianity is true, then good will ultimately win, not by strength of arms, but actually by the power of Jesus' death and resurrection.
Yeah, and I think that is a thread we see in so many stories, Christian, secular, we see over and over again this idea of self-sacrifice. And I think on just like this very human level, we understand that is what love is, because that is what Jesus is. And I think that's like one of the key points that I think when we should be looking, when we look at a story, to determine whether or not, is this something that's good? Is this something that's edifying? Is this something that my children should be taking part in? Is do they understand what love is, even if they're not able to verbalize it? Are they showing you these characters that are willing to set down their own goals and set down their own ideas of what should happen, or set down their own lives for one another? But yeah, I think that's the kind of thing that humans on a very basic level do understand, often do understand, and that's why we tell stories about it.
You mentioned earlier the sort of rise in interest in the occult and sort of spirits that are nothing to do with the one central spiritual being of the universe revealed in the Bible. It's interesting. I live up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Where do you live, Marian? Are you another part of the States?
I'm currently in Southern California, but my husband just got a job in South Carolina, so we'll be moving in a few months.
All right, from one SC to another. So I'm curious about what you see around you in Southern California, but up here in New England, there seems to be a great increase in interest and engagement with, frankly, the spiritual forces of evil. Whether it's via people doing tarot cards and sort of trying to read their futures that way, or whether it's through sort of ayahuasca ceremonies where they're trying to kind of connect with particular spirits, or there's in a way that I don't think was the case 10 years ago or 20 years ago, at least. Maybe it wasn't. I wasn't as familiar with it. That in our particular kind of cultural moment, there seems to be a spiritual hunger that that is being fed on false meat from these various sort of spiritual practices and desires. I did an episode at the end of the last season with a friend who'd previously been using crystals and doing tarot cards and sort of trying to fill the spiritual gap with all these kind of new age type practices. And I'm curious whether you think, Marian, that resurgence around us changes the conversation when it comes to works of literature that are engaging with magic, or how does it inflate that conversation? And do you see that in Southern California?
Yes and no. As far as changing the conversation. And do I see it in Southern California real quick? Yes. I think it's just mainstream right now. It's just everywhere. But I think that as far as does it change the conversation because of the growth of it, yes and no. The no in the sense that we always should be discerning what we're reading and what we're watching regardless. We should be, filtering it through the lens of Scripture. I provide 5 discernment questions in my book for how to think about a certain world building or magic system in works of fiction. And I would encourage anyone to do that always. But at the same time, are we seeing an increase in more pagan types of magic in books and in films, and even in games? Yes, we are. We're going to see it more, not just in things marketed to adults, but also things marketed to teens and to middle schoolers. Even children, I think I've seen kind of a very childlike toys, even in the toy aisle, of, things that are like a little, have like some ties to New Age objects. And I think that, it's going to be, it already has become an issue even before the growth of this, that parents especially are needing to really vet what their teenagers are reading, just because of the sexual content that's going into books right now. More so now, even more so, you need to be looking at the magic system, not just the sexual content in your YA fiction, because it is a problem right now. Things are going to look a little bit more pagan. But at the same time, we're still using the same discernment questions. We're still looking through the lens of the Bible. That has never changed. So,
talk us through those questions, Marian. I'm sure people will find it helpful.
Sure. So there's it'll probably take a little too long for me to go through all of them.
Right, give us just the first 2.
Yeah, sure. So the first one is very straightforward. What is the source of the magic? Where is it coming from? And the reason that I should probably preface this by saying the reason that I give discernment questions for where you're looking at the magic, where the magic is coming from, is because the language around magic and miracles changes for every book. Just because it uses the word magic doesn't necessarily mean they're talking about the occult. We see that, of course, in a very obvious example. You mentioned the deep magic in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The C.S. Lewis uses the word magic, the deep magic, in reference to the gospel. And so it's really, he's using it within the story world, and he's using it for a more metaphorical sense. And I think that is often true in books. So what they're using that word to mean could change depending on context. So we go back to context. So going back to the questions, the source of the magic, what is it? Not every book is going to say where their magic is coming from. But if there could be some sort of higher power. What kind of higher power is it? Is this a higher power in which you have to pay them sacrifices or your own blood or something like this in order to gain magic? That's going to be overtly pagan and occult in nature. Whereas if something more along the lines of Narnia, for example, it's very obvious that the source of the magic is Aslan, and then it has the Christian themes there. So that's the first question. And then sometimes when you can't determine what the source of the magic is, you have to go on to the next question, which would be, what's the goal? What are the characters trying to use their magic to do? Is it self-serving? Is it something that aligns more with the occult, which would be self-aggrandizement? There's this very clear streak of pride, or they're trying to gain secret knowledge for their own benefit. Things like that are very, very obviously a more occult in nature, whereas in something that would align more with Scripture would be they're trying to serve others. They are trying to help someone accomplish something in some way. There's always the upside down kingdom element to it, and to explain that term, it means that we see people as the last is first and the first is last. We serve the weak things of the world, and not trying to serve the rich and the wealthy in order to gain power. So, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, those are kind of some of the elements of the questions.
Yeah, it's interesting. So obviously, the Lord of the Rings is, both the Narnia Chronicles and the Lord of the Rings, written by very specifically Christian authors who are intentionally in their different ways, drawing on Christian themes. It's been interesting in the last sort of couple of decades seeing the Harry Potter series become, some of the most widely read books in the world, and J.K. Rowling also actually quite explicitly and specifically drawing on Christian themes and even sort of quoting Bible verses in her books, but as somebody who I think she sort of rather poignantly posted on X the other day that she has a God-shaped hole in her heart and has sort of not really known what to do with that since she was a teenager. And kind of I read an article or an interview with her a few years ago where she was sort of saying, depending on the day, she maybe would consider herself a Christian and maybe wouldn't, because she doesn't know. She's sort of very much, I think, seeking actually. But the world that she's created in the Harry Potter series, where there's such a strong division between sort of good magic and bad magic, as it were, or people who are using magic to serve others versus people who are using it to serve themselves or to harm others, and this overarching storyline of self-sacrifice being the key to overcoming evil is so richly Christian in its ethos that I guess is that sort of some of our listeners will disagree with me and maybe you on this, and that's fine. I do think there's much room for kind of Christians to act in conscience themselves on all these kinds of questions and figure out exactly where they land. But there's so much sort of fertile soil, I think, for thinking through what does it look like to be somebody who follows Jesus and who believes that at the center of reality is this man who died on a cross as the sacrifice for our sins, and rather than, as you were saying, in a sort of often in pagan sort of magical constructions, you give an offering to the god, maybe you sacrifice some sort of blood offering, or maybe you sacrifice somebody else in order to appease this god and kind of channel their power. And in the Christian story, it's completely the opposite, that actually God gives himself, that he makes the sacrifice so that we can be welcomed into a relationship with him, and that we can actually now have his spiritual power, not to aggrandize ourselves, not to make ourselves rich and successful in the world, but actually, as you were saying, to kind of serve those who are most in need, and to spread the message of the gospel kind of around the world to anyone who's willing to listen to it. And that there's so much kind of imaginative kind of potential there. I found even the other day as I was reading Lord of the Rings for probably, I don't know, the 15th time this time to my son, just there are moments when it sort of moves me spiritually. Like I'm more aware and more responsive to the sheer beauty of what Jesus has done and who he is because of what I'm reading. There's a sort of section in The Return of the King where Aragorn, who's the king who is returning in that story, comes to the city that he is ultimately going to rule from. And there's this sort of saying that the hands of the king are the hands of a healer. And so his first act before he's crowned king, before he really comes into his kingdom in an ultimate sense, his first act is to go around healing people who are sick, both physically and spiritually, who've sort of been infected by the evil that they've been trying to fight. And as I was reading that account, I was thinking, oh wow, like I cannot wait for when Jesus returns as king. Like, it just sort of opened up my heart once again, or in a new way, to the ultimate hope that Christians have, that one day the same man who 2,000 years ago was going around and healing people of both physical and spiritual sicknesses will one day return as universal Lord of all, and there'll be no, good will finally triumph over evil in the most unmistakable way. It just sort of warmed my heart to that. I'm curious, Marian, as we sort of think about the gospel accounts of Jesus' life and the ways in which he was engaging with evil, or unclean is sometimes the language used in the New Testament, spirits. What can we learn from those gospel accounts about spirits today? The reality of supernatural evil, and how, if we're followers of Jesus, how we relate to that.
How does it help us understand the spiritual context for today? I think it's important to remember that although Christ's ministry was, to some degree, a special time, I don't want to get too much into controversial theology here, but I think that it's important also to remember that these spirits are still at work today. I think we like to pretend that they're not, but there is a sense in which they were responding to Jesus in more overt ways at that time. But yeah, I think we need to remember that in our modern context, the way in which they are tempting us, they're approaching us, their attacks and their strategies are different, and they are adapted to our modern context, and they are just as active as they were at that time. And I think it's important to remember that. And I think we see that when we go and listen to the testimonies of, like you mentioned, your friend who had been into like New Age things. It's important to go and to listen to people who have actually had these firsthand experiences, to remind ourselves this is real. These things are trying to harm us, and they're not only active in foreign countries, they're active here. I think one of the ways that we can kind of calibrate is to go listen to those stories or go read those stories. They're on YouTube. They're in books. That you can look up. You can look it up in New Age to Jesus testimony videos on YouTube. They do get a little overwhelming, so I will give a warning. They can be pretty dark, but there is a growth in the New Age. There is a growth in people seeing there's a spiritual realm, but at the same time, that's not true for all people, and it's not necessarily true for certain generations. I think we see a lot more of that happening in younger generations. So I think it's important for people to go and see, like, wait, is this real? Am I going to like really hear and listen and try to understand the experience of these believers? And I think, and then it helps us to realize they're not the only ones who are being surrounded by this. I also am surrounded by this. I just can't see it because I'm being attacked in different ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's so interesting, as you mentioned. It's something that's actually not uncommon at the moment for people to come to Christ with that background. I actually have a couple of different friends here up in New England who've been through a bunch of wild and evil sort of spiritual encounters, with essentially evil spirits, and then recognized their need for Jesus and found hope and freedom and true sort of spiritual fulfillment in him. And it's really striking if you read through the gospel accounts of Jesus's life and you see him engaging with evil spirits who most typically have sort of taken people over, and that's manifesting in either kind of physical or sort of psychological ways of relating. There are a couple of things that you'll notice. One is that the evil spirits know who Jesus is. Like, they recognize Jesus as the Son of God, even when the humans around Jesus don't. You know, they know exactly who Jesus is, and they're absolutely terrified of him. Like, there's no question. It's not like, oh, well, you know, Jesus had this fight with this evil spirit and nobody was sure he was going to win, and like, just by the skin of his teeth, you know, Jesus triumphed. It's actually the demons are desperate to get away from Jesus. Like, they're frightened. They are completely terrified of Jesus. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize as still being true today. That there is a real spiritual realm. And it's sort of interesting. I feel like kind of 20 years ago, when I was in college and sort of talking with people about Christianity, I would have, in many cases, needed to sort of persuade my friends that there were supernatural. Anything was supernatural, you know, that it wasn't just a purely kind of naturalistic world. And that's certainly still true with some of my friends today. But I think for increasing proportions of people, it's not that as a Christian, I need to persuade anybody of the reality of spiritual forces. It's that I need to persuade them that actually, yes, those spiritual forces are real, but actually they're evil. They are demonic. They do not have your best interests at heart. You know, if you're reading tarot cards or grabbing onto crystals or doing various sort of spiritual ceremonies, you are not connecting with a spirit that is trying to do you good. You are actually connecting with an evil spirit that is trying to ruin you, and that Jesus is not only your only hope, but he is the hope beyond your wildest dreams. Like, he is the one before whom evil spirits flee, because they cannot deal with his power, and it's a power that's shown through his sacrifice for us, which is the most extraordinary and beautiful thing. That there's a sense in which I think once people become kind of attuned to the reality of a spiritual dimension to our world, they can then kind of wonder if good or evil is going to win. But from a Christian perspective, there's just absolutely no question.
Yeah, I think the stories that I'm referring to also help to remind us that as you're saying, like, these spirits are terrified of Jesus. And I think that when we hear also not just the stories of how people are coming to Christ, but of what they experienced just being involved with these entities, testimonies such as, you know, I was having what they call an astral attack, you know, which is, you know, it's when you astral project. This is getting a little weird, but when you astral project and you have an attack on you from like some sort of dark entity, they have found, people who are not believers, they have found that if they cry out to the name of Jesus, those entities will flee. And this is like a common thing that people do, that they call on the name of Jesus, even people who are not believers, in order to protect themselves from demonic entities in these types of situations. And I think it just speaks to the fact that, like you're saying, that he is all powerful, that they are terrified of him, and that he is the one who is supreme here.
Last question, Marian. I like to ask people who join me on this podcast how they became a Christian or why they find Jesus to be compelling today. I'd love to hear, or I'd love for our listeners to hear your answer to that question. Yeah,
I think that I can't directly answer how I became a Christian. I don't remember becoming one. I was very young, but I can say that I can answer why I stayed a Christian. Mm-hmm. And I think that it through childhood trauma and severe teen depression, and all sorts of, suffering that you have, especially when at a young age, that I could consistently feel as though I was barely keeping my head above water. and that sometimes you look back, and I think people may see, look at that, I did it, I pulled through, and I just look back and I just see Jesus holding my head above water, and that's all I can see. And I think that there were times where I could not hold on to him, but he held on to me. And I think that just speaks to the fact that that he is just that God is such a good and loving Father. And now I see, and now I'm able to not only say thank you for my salvation, but also thank you for my life. So
yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Marian. You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow us on X or Instagram. You can subscribe to our brand new YouTube channel where you can watch these conversations as well as listening to them. You can grab a copy of Marian's book on magic and miracles wherever good books are sold, online or in person. And between now and the next time I talk into your headphones, if you ever want to listen to this podcast again, I would encourage you to reflect on the reality of spiritual forces and to recognize the fact that there is good and evil in this world. I think we can all, at some deep level, recognize that, and that the story that Christianity offers for the hope of the world, the redemption of the world, the triumph of good over evil, the triumph of love and justice and truth and goodness that we all deeply long for in our bones, regardless of how we identify religiously, that story might not only be the most compelling story that's ever been told, but that it might actually also be true.